good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're joining us from. And thank you for joining us today. My name is Lilian Joro, the head of experimentation at UNDP, the United Nations Development Program in Kenya. And as Brenda said, we're here to share with you a project we've been doing around mis and disinformation. So I think we'll start off with some introductions. Yes, so as I said, Lilian Joro, head of experimentation at UNDP. So UNDP is the United Nations leading development agency. And our work, we work in 170 countries addressing issues of poverty, inequality, and climate change. In Kenya, our portfolio falls under three main categories. So one is governance, peace, and security. Two, inclusive growth and structural transformation. And three is environmental sustainability and climate change resilience. And we have also within UNDP the Accelerator Labs network, which is an initiative that was launched in 2019 to have the world's fastest and largest learning network on sustainable development challenges. So we have 91 labs embedded within 115 UNDP country offices around the world. And so that's the team specifically within UNDP in Kenya that I work in. And I have my colleague, Caroline Kimondo, who's the head of exploration in the lab. Unfortunately, she's not able to join us today, but she passes her regards. I'll hand over to Gideon to introduce the Busara team.
Thank you, Lilian. Morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Gideon Tor. I am an engagement director at the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, based out of our Nairobi office. Joining me today are my colleagues who saw the end-to-end implementation of the study, Ruth Kanagaraja, who's a consultant, Brenda Ogutu, Senior Research Associate, and Nelson Mugi, a Senior Research Analyst. We're also joined by a couple of our colleagues from Comms, Michael and Busara, who will be helping us in the session today. So Busara, or the full name, Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, is a research and advisory organization focused on the evaluation and implementation of behavioral, economic, and social interventions in several countries, primarily in the global south. So we work with a range of partners in the private, public, and social sectors, including partners like UNDP Kenya, to apply behavioral science insights, principles, and rigorous research methods to design, to experiment, or to evaluate some of their programs or products or policies targeted at alleviating poverty. We were founded in 2013, and we have country operations in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and India, although we have project presence across most of sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Latin America, and a few countries in the South Pacific. So I'll hand you over to our colleague Enoch as well to introduce himself and his contribution to the project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gideon. So my name is Enoch Nyariki, and I work as the Community and Impact Manager at the International Fact-Checking Network. I'm here to make my remarks because when this project was starting, I used to be the managing editor of PesaCheck, and we made a contribution on the quality of claims that were flagged by users. So it's in that capacity that I'm here.
Thank you, Enoch and Gideon, for that. So in terms of the agenda for today's workshop, we'll start off with, we've started off with a welcome, and now we get into a bit of the context setting and giving a background to why we're here. And then we'll dive into the meat of things, which is the experiment findings, then followed by a panel session and some question and answer. And before we finish with a wrap up and some closing reflections. So for those who are joining us as we continue, please, we have an icebreaker question. We want to hear what's the craziest bit of misinformation or disinformation that you've come across recently on the internet. So you can answer that in the chat box. In terms of the housekeeping, please use the chat box to post any comments, questions. We also have the Q&A function. We can also post there. Over the course of the workshop, we'll try to answer as many questions as we can, whether in the chat or live. And as I mentioned at the end, we'll have the panel discussion and Q&A where we can dive more into the questions. So now straight into the context setting and the background. So, the issue of mis and disinformation is not necessarily something new. It's something that's been around, but it's becoming more prevalent in recent years, especially with the growth of the internet and the digital platforms and how easy it is to spread information. And this became even more relevant during the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw growing mistrust with institutions like governments, mainstream media, health institutions, and so on. In terms of terminologies, we define information pollution as a phenomenon where facts and figures become a source of division in a society, and this impacts the behavior of the community, social cohesion, and public trust. As Brenda said at the beginning, misinformation is when false information is shared without the intent of harm, but disinformation is when it's shared with the deliberate intent to harm or to benefit certain interest groups. So for us at UNDP, like I mentioned, we have the governance, peace, and security portfolio. So issues around public trust have always been interest for us, but particularly for the Accelerator Lab, we came to look at misinformation specifically within the frame of the pandemic back in 2020, seeing how this was actively impeding public health efforts towards addressing the pandemic. And within that, we came up with our portfolio, trying to look at different approaches that we can use, whether that's leveraging technology, data, or targeting the creative sector to see how to address some of those gaps that were providing the breeding ground for the misinformation and disinformation to thrive within the early days of the pandemic. And so within that context, UNDP Accelerator Labs globally came into a partnership with the Healthy Internet Project, which is incubated at TED. And this was to use their crowdsourcing platform that they had been working on, or prototyping, and test it within different country contexts through the Accelerator Lab network, and basically use that to get more insights on the crowdsourcing approach when it comes to addressing misinformation. So this was an experiment that was carried out in 8 countries, including Kenya. I think we had Argentina, Togo, Iraq, Sudan, and a few others. And each Accelerator Lab in the respective countries was working with local partners, figuring out the specific area of research that they wanted to do using the Healthy Internet tool. So for us in Kenya, we wanted to approach it from the angle of looking at the behavioral insights lens, trying to understand what are some of the user behaviors and motivation that would make such kind of tools successful as an approach for addressing misinformation and disinformation online. And that's how we came to work with Busara Center. So I'll invite Gideon to speak a bit more about that.
Yes, thanks, Lillian. So as Lillian mentioned, the origins of this project lie in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, sometime in mid-2020. As the number of cases around the world significantly grew and countries began shutting down and instituting lockdowns, I think we were all individually and collectively deeply concerned, because, and a big contributing factor to that is we have very little information about the disease. And what started as a result of that, the digital public sphere, so the internet, broadly speaking, quickly became polluted by a lot of misinformation and disinformation about the health crisis as a result of a general lack of information. And what, from our point of view as behavioral scientists, we realized that COVID-19 is more than a health crisis. It was a pivotal moment for our understanding of how misinformation and disinformation can threaten certain behaviors and social cohesion, and starting to think about social norms and how the determinants of how we interact with each other was evolving. So the COVID-19 pandemic provided a very useful case study for how these two types of information overlap and how they work together. And one of the interesting things about it is the disease was experienced in a diverse set of ways, depending on the location of the country that you lived in. So you can recall, for example, in the region, how the governments in Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania all had different ways of approaching the pandemic and communicating the impact to its citizens. And so we saw different responses, which actually exacerbated and made the impact of misinformation. As medical and public health experts across the world were working together to answer questions such as what causes the pandemic, where did it come from, how is it transmitted, what are the symptoms to look out for, etc. Behavioral scientists like us and others across the world were trying to make sense of social aspects of the pandemic. And so this is when Busara and UNDP Accelerator Labs team, our paths crossed, and we quickly realized that we had a mutual set of interests to not only better understand the misinformation and disinformation space, particularly on the internet, but also to try and develop and test potential long-term solutions that would last beyond the pandemic. So our team today will walk us through some of what we did, exactly what we did in the research, what the prototype looked like, and some of the findings from the study. So over, back to you, Lillian.
Thank you. So yes, so this is how the Healthy Internet Project, or HIP, we'll use the term HIP over the course of this workshop, looks like. So it's a plugin that you can install on your web browser. So, Google Chrome, Mozilla, Firefox. And you can then go ahead and flag any content that you come across as you're browsing the internet. And these are the 4 categories. You can, flag information as worthwhile ideas, worth sharing, lies or manipulation, abuse or harassment, or division of fear. And there's a scale from mild, medium, and severe across which you can flag the content. Just to add that for the Healthy Internet Project team, one of the key things that was very important to them is anonymity. So for this plugin, you don't need to give any identifying information like your email address or mobile phone number or anything like that. Once you download the plugin, every user has a unique ID. So to try and kind of address some of the concerns that people may have when it comes to flagging mis or disinformation online. I think I'll ask, Nelson will post the plugin in the chat for those who are interested in having a look at that. But now I think let's get straight into the key experimental findings. So I'll hand over to Brenda to take us through that.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much for the introduction. So once we started the project, we decided to figure out what's the best way to approach the project, to get this plugin to the people, and to figure out how best it's working, or how we can leverage like crowdsourcing, like voluntary crowdsourcing. So let me hand over to Ruth to take us through the approach we landed on and how that went about.
Great, thanks, Brenda. So as mentioned, we have a very grounded interest in understanding and seeking strategies that address mis and disinformation in its different forms. For instance, it's really well established in behavioral science research that this process of critically evaluating information is cognitively expensive, particularly on kind of like digital information platforms where users are often bombarded with a barrage of information every time they refresh their home screens. However, a lot of the behavioral insights is usually focused on this kind of passive reactionary end of misinformation and disinformation. This engagement with UNDP, we thought, gave us an opportunity to kind of turn this dynamic a little bit on its head with an interesting peek into how people actively deal with and identify misinformation at will over a period of time. And this, we thought, also had really important ramifications for future interventions. Therefore, when we had this opportunity to engage with UNDP, we wanted to see the full scope of how volunteers tasked with assessing misinformation would use this platform and how they went about identifying misinformation. So our objective with UNDP was to understand potential users' motivations, experiences, and practices in using the volunteer-driven crowdsourcing platform to flag misinformation. We wanted to see if this intrinsically driven approach, meaning that there weren't any external incentivizations involved, worked, and what didn't work and what needed to change. So we teased these objectives into the following themes. We have user patterns, and here we looked at the platform or the plugin and its user friendliness, how users experience the interface, their average time spent using the extension, and the time of day users prefer using the extension. We also looked at user motivations and barriers. Here we're talking about key demographics that were segmented by plugin usage, what drove users to use this volunteer-driven plugin, what were their motivations for reporting misinformation, and whether the platform should maybe consider other intrinsic or maybe even extrinsic incentives to encourage use. Next is an important element. We wanted to look at user accuracy. Are people flagging misinformation appropriately? Do they understand the flagging definitions? Here we engaged with the support of PesaCheck to validate our claims associated or user claims associated with the study. And then finally, we wanted to look at value proposition. We were interested in seeing if there's a promise in the future for volunteer-driven crowdsourcing misinformation. So first we wanted to see, what is the value proposition of this HIP tool itself as an innovative approach for tackling online misinformation and disinformation. But aside from that, what is the broader idea of volunteer-driven crowdsourcing approaches in tackling misinformation and disinformation? And could other platforms adapt this basic volunteer-driven crowdsourcing approach themselves in the future? I can move on to the next slide. So the way that we broke down this engagement was through the phases that you see here. First, there was a live demonstration. Then we did a mixed methods behavioral mapping, and then finally analysis to see what kind of themes and tensions were arising from our findings. In phase one, the live demonstration was this kind of quasi-natural experiment with the plugin. What we mean by a natural experiment is that we aimed for an observational study with kind of minimal intrusion on our parts as researchers to really assess how long and how often our respondents naturally wanted to use this plugin. After all, kind of the whole purpose of this study was to create a structured test case on how the average Kenyan user would want to interact with this plugin. And so we targeted Kenyans of different demographics living in both urban and rural locations, and we recruited them through demographic segmentation. However, we did provide a brief onboarding on the plugin's essentials, so it might not be entirely natural, but we essentially, after this very kind of brief onboarding, we left them to their devices for a minimum of 2 to 4 weeks in engaging with this plugin. After the live experiment, we conducted quantitative analysis to see the trends on usage patterns and how the plugin was used. Following this, we followed this up with mixed methods behavioral mapping, in which a subsample of respondents were invited for interviews in order for us to get more nuanced understandings of the findings captured in the live experimentation phase. So we wanted to capture here the user engagement and their ideas about crowdsourcing approaches like HIP, their willingness to report, and their perceptions of crowdsourcing platforms in tackling misinformation. We also wanted to kind of hone in on some behavioral factors that we thought might play a part in how volunteers are driven to report on this platform. So self-efficacy, which is, do users have belief in their ability to affect an improvement in the quality of information on the internet at scale? Perceived peer norms. When users are looking at their peers, how are their peers' beliefs and attitudes impacting an individual's proclivity to report? And then finally, perceived risk. How do users perceive risks involved with, reporting certain types of sensitive misinformation, such as political misinformation? Are these risks significant enough to hinder participation? And, is the idea, as Lillian mentioned, that the foundation of this plugin is anonymity? Does that hold true with our users? Do they actually believe that the anonymity is there and could possibly protect them when they are dealing with more sensitive reporting? So to the next slide, just to give you an idea of our sample size, in our live portion of the study, we had 205 participants who we invited to engage with this plugin for a minimum of 2 weeks. And as mentioned, we kind of observed their behaviors on the back end as they went about their own way using this plugin at their will. And then after the end of the live experiment, then we followed it up with 39 in-depth interviews and a 5-person focus group discussion. And then finally, we obviously, took the analyses of both and, try to make sense of what this narrative could mean. So I'll hand it over now to Brenda, who will share our findings from this experiment.
Yeah, so like Ruth mentioned, we onboarded about 200 people onto the platform. So we recruited them from like different places in Nairobi, and then had them download the extension tool. So this extension tool is open source, and we had them download it and then let them use it for a few weeks, and then came back and talked to them, or like analyze the data and then talked to them. So the first thing we found is that most people, or the people that we onboarded, these 200 people, many of them had never reported misinformation. So there's no formal way of how they had reported before. But there are things like the Facebook, the report button, or like Safaricom allowing you to report, or like people emailing people to tell them what's wrong with information, but there was no like formal way of doing it. So we find that less than 10% of these people had never flagged misinformation online. So like this person says, there's social media platforms where you can have a report button that can be used to report misinformation, but not really such a formal way of doing it. So we find that despite this platform being put for us to flag misinformation or to figure out who are these people spreading misinformation and disinformation, this tool also allows you to flag worthwhile content. So like Ruth mentioned, there are other behavioral things that come into play, like maybe people have risk, and I'll let Mugi talk more into that, like what are these barriers? But you find that people are more likely to report worthwhile content on the internet. So, and the reasons are, when we qualitatively ask them, is that, there's so much worthwhile content online. I want my peers to know, I want my family to know. But because they find that's less risky for them, nobody's going to come after you when you share worthwhile content, or there's no really perceived risk to reporting worthwhile content. So we find like 75% of the flags were worthwhile content. So this is something to think about, like when creating such platforms, like how do you want people to feel safe to report, not worthwhile content or harmful content on the internet, which is lies, abuse, and such kind of things. So despite them reporting this worthwhile content, the platform also allows you to give the severity of the flag. So is it minor, medium, severe, meaning is this something that can cause extensive harm, or if it's worthwhile, is it just like of minor use for somebody, or severe use, like really useful for them? So we find that for such content, it's on the minor side, but when it comes to information on lies and manipulation, this received the highest like severity. So most people, when they tag that information or when they flag misinformation that's on lies and manipulation, you find that it's more severe. So you see this person is saying like for them, they're a positive person, so they only flag positive content online. So, we want to think about how to get them to flag the misinformation, which is entirely not entirely, but the main purpose of our platform. So we find that after using this for a while, we find that the people I find this really useful for them, or it's an appropriate tool. So other than the reporting and you don't know who's looking at it, you don't know who's going to get back to you, this feels more of a formal way for you to flag misinformation. It feels like an appropriate tool whereby, if it's a formal approach, there's somebody on the other side of the computer formally seated and waiting for you to flag this, and then we'll verify the quality and go after the person you flagged, or the company or whoever it is that you flagged. So this is more of a formal way where you're going to get to the people and get them to flag and crowdsource information from the public. So maybe Mugi, you can take us through some of the barriers that we came across for the tool.
Yes, thanks, Brenda. Hi, everybody. As Brenda has already introduced, my name is Mugi. I'll be taking us through this section of our findings, speaking about the barriers that were experienced by study participants during the run of our study. One of them was that, there was the issue of anonymity, which Ruth has already kind of touched on already. Users are not entirely certain that their use of the platform itself, the activity on the platform was, anonymous. And even though I suppose the training on how to use the platform would have covered this bit of information, you can imagine that many users would still remain skeptical if they had any lingering doubts about their anonymity while on the platform itself. Participants also reported that they were somewhat unable, to tell whether something was actually, misinformation or disinformation at times. They could, for instance, foresee the potential of harm that a piece of information could cause, but there wasn't always, I suppose, the certainty that would need to come along with that to guarantee that, when they flagged something as misinformation, as lies and manipulation, that it would not, necessarily have any untoward repercussions, so to speak. We have a quote here from one of our participants. This is a participant who was male of 22 years from Nairobi. They said, you may become a target due to reporting through cyberbullying, and people might end up causing harm to you, physical, if they know who you are. So again, here, this is somebody who's reiterating that a key barrier to the use of the platform was the uncertainty as to whether or not their activities on the platform would remain anonymous. Another barrier that was also evident, this should be on the next slide, from our study from our participants was that internet challenges weren't, internet access wasn't always something that participants had. You can imagine a good many people might have access to, say, Wi-Fi in their residential homes or at their workplaces in places like Nairobi, but some of our districts were a little bit far flung from the city itself. And, you would imagine the data bundles would be by and large how many people would be able to gain connectivity to the internet. So access to the internet did actually, limit the amount of time that people were able to report spending on the internet using the HIP plugin, and that did come up as a challenge. Also, the participants also noted that they did not always come across harmful content. This might have something to do with the fact that the internet is also kind of a curated space. Many internet providers, many websites, so to speak, have a tendency to just group information for people that they would more likely respond or react to. So this might be, things that people like, or things that people have engaged with successfully in the past. And so, as you can imagine, that alone, among other considerations, would severely limit the extent to which people come across disagreeable content on the internet. That might have been some of why we saw a lot of people flagging worthwhile, ideas on the internet, but not so many, I suppose, in comparison, flagging, misinformation and disinformation. We also had the challenge that the users were not entirely comfortable with the subjectivity that was involved with making a decision whether something was harmful content or whether something, was lies and manipulation. We have already touched on that in the previous slide. There was also the fact that humans, being risk averse as we are, our study participants reported that they did not want to cause any harm to anybody. right? So sometimes even if somebody had come across a piece of information and they had reasonable, doubt about its validity, they thought maybe it was disinformation or misinformation, they would definitely have had to contend with the innate sense that they would be causing someone harm if they reported this information, either the person who contributed to the information itself, or the person in charge of checking the quality of information on that platform, or the person about whom the information actually is. So that also was highlighted as a barrier from our study. We have another quote here from a male participant who was 23 years of age. Because we tend to flag things that are negative, they are not, they're not many. The idea was that the plugin itself was at least ostensibly put out to curb the spread of misinformation and disinformation. However, there was the not too many things, I suppose, were disagreeable. So said our participants, not too many things that they came across on the internet. Another key consideration, this should move us to the next section from our study itself, was whether or not there was any accuracy to the reports, to the flags that were being registered by our respondents. So we wanted to make certain that even though we were kind of taking it as a given that most of our study participants had been trained appropriately and would ethically use the platform itself, we still wanted to do some digging in the background to see whether or not they would actually be reporting something as misinformation that was in fact misinformation, or reporting something as worthwhile content that was in fact worthwhile content. So the question here was, how accurate were these reports? Content reporting accuracy was something that we thought to outsource as an opportunity to collaborate with PesaCheck. At the time, we have with us an ex-PesaCheck employee, Enoch Nyariki, if I may use the term ex-PesaCheck. He hasn't himself used it, but he has been very, very valuable to us in this particular phase of the research, just kind of figuring out the validity of the tags themselves. So Enoch, without further ado, I would welcome you into this conversation with just two questions. I'll start by just outlining them. So from analyzing the sample of the flags that we sent over to PesaCheck to check for validity, what was your sense about how accurate this crowdsourcing reporting solution can be? Right? What was your sense about how accurate it can be? And a corollary to that question is what could be done to improve that accuracy? But over to you, Ed.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Yeah, so at the time I used to lead the team at PesaCheck, which does fact checking in 12 countries. So when we received these claims you shared with us, at that time we didn't understand very well about the HIP tool, about the options that users were given. For example, things like flagging abuses or harassment, diffusion or fear, and also worthwhile content. So when we received this, the claims that you shared with us, we were only looking at them as at these posts that are fact checkable. Is this something that a fact checker can pick, go do research and produce a fact check as a result of it? So that was our thinking when we were looking at the accuracy of claims, or how good were the claims that were flagged. And our findings were not very many of them. Actually, it was less than 10% of what we received were fact checkable, if you will. But now I understand why, because there was also the option of flagging all these kind of categories. For example, abuses or harassment may not necessarily be misinformation. Actually, the team, the global team looking at harassment of fact checkers, so it's something I'm very deeply passionate about, but it may not be necessarily misinformation or diffusion of fear. Someone can use something else which may not be fact checkable misinformation. But lies, of course, can be, or is mostly misinformation. Manipulation may also not be misinformation, if you will, because that's influence operations. It's more propaganda, so it falls under the large category, but it's not necessarily something that's fact checkable. So our the way we looked at it was we're looking at those posts, the links that were flagged, and asking ourselves, is this something that a fact checker, is this a tool that can help even fact checkers to get easily posts circulating on the internet that are misleading, that can be fact checked by professional fact checkers. So that was our sense of it. And if, as a fact checker myself, if to give my view on what needs to be done to improve the tool, I'll say perhaps we narrowing down if the focus is to use it to flag misinformation. Maybe we not dwell too much on worthwhile content, because now that sort of creates confusion. But have like a special section, or the entire section be about flagging misinformation, and then also do media literacy campaigns so that users know what to look out for. Like we have a few indicators of something that is likely false, things like checking the source. If you see a post on Instagram, Facebook, or even a website, check the source. Is this source trusted? Is this credible source? Check the author. Who has written this? Do they have a reputation for producing accurate reports? Also check other sources. If you see breaking news story about a major story in the country, and that was posted about 5 or so hours ago, and no other credible mainstream news outlet has covered that, then a user will have doubts that this is likely misleading. Also, examining the evidence given to support the report, going beyond headlines, because there's that behavior of clickbait headlines, checking whether something is a joke, because we have some websites that are satirical, or someone can post something on social media which is satire. So you need to be aware if they're joking or if it's something that's serious. Also being aware of your own biases, because one of the things I saw during the examination of the post was some users flagging opinion that they disagreed with, apparently, because fact checkers don't look into opinions. They just look at things that are fact checkable, that are in the past and not into the future. Yeah, so doing some media literacy campaigns on misinformation, so users are more aware of posts that are likely to be false, so they don't flag everything. Because one of the other things we saw was maybe it's because of the worthwhile content, users were flagging the entire URL of our website. So it left fact checkers confused, like, what are we supposed to look? Because if you flag the entire homepage, now they'll be looking everywhere trying to find the post that is likely false, because that's out there trying to think. Yeah, so in terms of making this tool, if it's be made to flag misinformation only, that's what I think can be done to make it more worthwhile. And I think it has a potential to help fighting misinformation at scale, because that's a worldwide issue. I work with fact checkers at the moment all over the world, and they struggle with this issue of finding misinformation before it can lead to harm, and also producing fact checks. It takes long to identify claims which are misleading and perhaps going viral. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that nuance to what it is that we are presenting. And thank you especially for bringing forth the importance of actually, kind of identifying what's even fact checkable in the same, regard, right? Like, what can we necessarily say, is a fact, and what can we necessarily say is contravening to a fact? I have just one, probing question, I suppose. Is there any potential for information that's not fact checkable to cause harm still? And if there is potential for information that is not fact checkable to cause harm, what I suppose are the crowdsourced solutions that could be leveraged to still address these potentials for harm without necessarily labeling them as misinformation or disinformation? Yeah. Are we just powerless if we cannot classify them either way?
Great question again. Thank you so much. If you look at even the crisis in Ukraine at the moment, there's a lot of propaganda and influence operations, things that are not necessarily fact checkable. So back to your question, harassment, abuse, sort of like violating the policies of the platforms like Facebook, Twitter. I think what can be done at the moment using the available avenues is to report the abuse to, I don't know if this tool can have like a collaboration or a working relationship with some major internet companies, so that if they receive reports of a site or a link that violates this, because all these platforms are keen to address harassment and abuse of their terms of service. So if they receive those reports, they can take action. Right now, I know most of these tech platforms have avenues where users can report if they think some post or some account is violating their terms of service, which, as you say, some of the content that is not fact checkable can cause real world hate speech, all these abuses and harassment or division of fear. So it's very, very important. We have some groups that work around that. Fact checkers are not that deeply involved. And I think those are the current avenues that can be used to address this issue.
Great, awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Gentle reminder to everyone in the call today, in the webinar, whatever questions you might have for any one of our panelists, please utilize the question and answer feature. They will be able to respond in this particular session to a sample of them, I suppose. So please do not hesitate. We're going to then transition into the panel discussion itself. I know that everybody at least has had a chance to wave at the audience, so I won't labor another round of introductions. Right, so we're going to start at this point by inviting Ruth and Brenda just to touch on the behavioral outcomes of our study, the study that we conducted. So welcome, Ruth and Brenda as well. So on the issue of anonymity, users fear that they will be identified through platform use itself, right? We noticed that there was a political angle as well from the qualitative work that we were doing. We noticed that users were all the less likely to report information if it had a political bent to it. What does this speak, or what I suppose are the behavioral levers in play when we observe such behavior? I should start by asking Ruth first before Brenda.
I mean, I think so when you say behavioral levers, you're saying what are possible solutions around this, right? And because the perceived risk in terms of anonymity and sensitive content is understandably high. I think there's two different ways to go about this. The first thing is to quell any anxieties around anonymity, whether that is like proof of concept or, insight into what in the process makes it anonymous. I think you can say that something is anonymous, but without seeing what are kind of like the back-end processes that validate this, that can guarantee this, it's kind of conceptually hard to just trust that when someone says this is anonymous. So that's one thing. After something like that is taken care of, another thing I was thinking is that the identity of a volunteer is something that can really be experimented with. And so when you're a volunteer, do you see yourself in this kind of context as simply a volunteer in, for an experiment that's told what to do, or in the real world as just, someone that has taken their free time to do this? Do you see yourself as a sort of guardian in, this social network sphere with all your friends, as someone that protects them from information that isn't correct? Do you see yourself as a moral arbiter? And these kind of like identity elements, I think, have a really interesting effect on the sense of kind of intrinsic drive that a volunteer has, and like the meaningfulness of engaging with a plugin like this. And so I think those are a few different ways to kind of test in the future. One, to guarantee or to show what guarantees the anonymity, but two, to really understand the framing of the identity of the volunteer.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that, Ruth. You've also touched on the issue of motivation, I suppose. What intrinsically could be motivating use on the platform itself. This question then goes to Brenda. Brenda, if you could just touch on briefly on the theme of accuracy, which was also something that we had as an objective to study, user accuracy on the platform. We know that Enoch has already kind of spoken to that. So users had reported that they don't really know whether information is correct or incorrect, right? Accurate or inaccurate, let alone whether or not it's misleading in a way that, could amount to lies and manipulation, or whether it's disinformation that could cause harm otherwise. So my question is, what could be done, I suppose, to better kind of distinguish the purpose of the tool itself? I know that we had been mulling over some suggestions of maybe removing the worthwhile tool altogether, because if people have an escape, they don't necessarily have to just identify misinformation or identify lies and manipulation. They might very well never have to do it. But I just wanted to give you a chance to just field those discussions that we were having about how is it that we could, one, educate the users on how accurately to use the platform, and also just to encourage them to actually use it to flag misinformation. Over to you, Brenda.
My apologies, Mugi. Could you please repeat that last part?
Right, of course.
Yeah.
So the first part was how could we first educate the users on the accuracy considerations, and also, I suppose, how could we make it more likely that they would use the platform accurately to flag misinformation and to flag disinformation?
Yeah, okay. So while talking to them, I think Enoch actually has alluded to it, but you find that people are flagging like a whole URL, or they're not entirely sure, and they're also using their own opinions. So if I can use that as well, like we're thinking that making the platform more specific. So having like a box somewhere where the people can specifically say, this is the part where I'm talking about, or even just like put the quote, or like put the
Brenda?
I can fill in for Brenda while we're waiting for this to happen. So I have some ideas. I think one thing that was really obvious from this experiment was that the difference between knowing the policy and applying a policy are two very different things. So you can know what worthwhile content means. You can
image
know
of exactly what they're speaking of. This can make it a bit more accurate, so that you don't just go in. And then also in terms of media campaigns, or like train people.
Right. Thank you for coming back, Brenda. We lost you there for a few good seconds, and Ruth had just started to fill in, so there was a little bit of cacophony there. How about, if you don't mind, Brenda, just repeating the last bit of your contribution, and then Ruth can come in. Sorry, you're muted, it would seem.
Yeah, sorry. I think at the end of it, things are now starting to fall apart. But I was just going to finish and say that, it's people are using their opinion, even if you are flagging misinformation. Now that we are going into an election period, you'll find that people will start flagging based off of opinion. So I do agree with Enoch in terms of like training people on how to flag misinformation. How we onboarded them already was the first step, and they had a
It would seem that we've lost Brenda again. Okay. Well, Ruth, I suppose this is as good a time as any.
Okay. Sorry, there's coming to be a lot of back and forth between ideas here. But yeah, the idea I was saying is that knowing a policy versus applying a policy are two very different things. So you can know what those flags mean, but without the context to apply it, those are just two very different actions. And so one thing for the trainings is something that's like case-led trainings, I think, like really knowing how to appropriately use the flag through case studies, through information on the internet that we've sorted ourselves. The other thing that I think is really worth mentioning is in order to increase the longevity and the meaningfulness of the volunteer engagement here, but also to make sure there's some kind of clarity. there's approaches to gamify this solution. So Cambridge University in 2021 did an experiment where they gamified how to identify misinformation, just as a start, not even, you know, call it out, flag it out, but how to identify it through a gamified approach, which I think really helped take users through a long process of really understanding, here are the different ways misinformation can arise. It is, you know, something that is slightly off about Joe Biden's handle on Twitter, like it has a tilde on the end, for instance, like that is a fake user, that's not Joe Biden. Another thing is, you know, the emotional cues, etc., that users should be aware of. So I do think awareness and education before using a platform or a plugin like this is really important. Because, I mean, we come from the behavioral side of things. We know that a lot of our possible volunteers and users are grounded in certain information and certain echo chambers before even getting onto this plugin, right? They have a history of kind of taking in a lot of different types of accurate information as well as misinformation. And then this impacts how they play a role on the plugin itself. And so I think taking it back a few steps through gamified trainings, education, or maybe in the future having a kind of authenticity check, or some kind of authenticity check about the volunteer, like certain tiers of volunteers would be the ones that would engage with this platform or this plugin. Sorry, I keep going between the two. But I think, yeah, there's kind of, I think what has been shown to us from this natural experiment is areas we can keep experimenting on in a more controlled fashion in the future, now that we know where there are issues of sensitivity, anonymity, you know, discomfort, to be honest, with identifying misinformation, being the arbiter of deciding that something is misinformation or not. So yeah, I think we've seen a lot of opportunities on how to kind of go forward through other research avenues.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much. I especially enjoyed the alliteration that came somewhere toward the end of your presentation there. And now over to Gideon. Hi, Gideon. I have just a few questions, I suppose, that we would like an answer to from you, given your massive experience in, you know, just behavioral levers and barriers and the like. So what are effective ways, I suppose, to keep users motivated to use the platform, right? From our, you know, research, some of the suggestions that we had gotten from users was, you know, maybe a kind of monetary incentivization to at least counter the cost of the internet access sometimes, and also just to keep, I suppose, them motivated to use the platform itself. We also got quite some interesting responses that didn't have anything to do with monetary incentivization. For instance, the suggestion that if they got feedback as to, you know, the validity of their reports, they might be able to kind of upscale their, you know, reporting standards, so to speak, right? So having highlighted, you know, the possibility for monetary incentivization and also the possibility for feedback to motivate use of the platform, I wonder what you might have to say about just the general question. How can we keep, I suppose, folks motivated to kind of use the platform over and above those that we have mentioned and those that Ruth has touched on?
Okay. Sure. Thanks, Mugi. Maybe to best answer your question, maybe to give some background or some context, I think we all understand that in recent years, the burden of verifying information that we come across has shifted from the content producer to the consumer or audiences of any information, right? This role of verifying information traditionally used to be done by public interest media. So radio, print, they were responsible for making sure that before any bit of information is put out there, it's verified in one form or another. But in the world we live in today, both these media houses having shifted a lot of the content online and having taking cues from what users or audiences are flagging as important or worth highlighting. This is becoming a lot harder to do, and the responsibility to engage and accurately judge whether a piece of information is true is now on us. And I think for any potential solutions to this challenge of verifying information, now that the responsibility is on us and not on the gatekeepers, it's important to, I think, internalize two things as you're coming up with solutions. So one, Ruth alluded earlier that from a behavioral science point of view, this process of verifying information, of critically evaluating what you're coming across, is what we call cognitively expensive. It's because it requires you as a user or as an audience to evaluate and critically evaluate all types of bits of information, which is very difficult to do in a very noisy timeline, right? Even for the most conscientious audience or consumer that is really trying to pay a lot of attention to whether this is accurate or not, that can be difficult, especially when there's just a lot of information coming at you and you're scrolling through your timeline on Twitter or Facebook. At some point, you stop paying attention to the accuracy and start to just basically engage with information as you're receiving it. So because the human mind can only process and hold very little information, it's really important for any potential solution or any individual organization trying to come up with a solution to really interrogate and try and understand how different types of audiences evaluate different types of information, right? And this includes misinformation and disinformation, not just neutral or positive information. So this can start to point you to the right directions on how to come up with different strategies and interventions that would speak to the different audience segments that your content or content is received. And then the second thing to remember, and I think all of us know this, but it's always, I think it's important for us to keep in mind because it's very relevant here, is that the truth is always at a disadvantage when you compare it with misinformation. Someone, I think it was Christine Karanja earlier in the chat, mentioned that recently, I think a few days ago, the Communications Authority of Kenya, after much public outroar online about the re-registration of SIM cards, they came out with a clarifying statement saying that only users who hadn't registered their SIM cards should now go back to the service provider to do this, to do that. It just brought a lot of confusion, and that's a form of corrective campaign, which is by its very nature, it's reactive, and it will, even no matter how well-meaning that form of communication is, it's already coming at a time when the story has been spun off and gone in different directions, and everyone's linking it to political outcomes, everyone's linking it to this and that. And so it's always important to start to push for solutions before information permeates through different social networks. And related to that, it's also important to remember that information that is scientific, that is factual, is generally dry. It's not as exciting as clickbait headlines. And it's a fact we cannot disagree with, we cannot go around, but it's just important for us to always remember, as we're framing different, as content producers, you're framing different types of information, just know you're working against, if it's the truth, if it's a fact, it can work, it's always working against something that's more exciting, which is misinformation. And then similarly to that, point on the truth, it's important to remember that the relationships that we as citizens have with our governments, our states, and experts is, for a variety of reasons, always a bit rocky, right? People have a lot of doubts in their governments, which, when pieces of information comes from them, it can be sometimes difficult or almost impossible for some segments of the society to be like, okay, I think they're telling the truth this time. It's just really hard to know when who's telling the truth and what, when that relationship historically is sort of a bit challenging. So in summary, just any solutions that we're trying to come up with as organizations, as fact checkers, just keep those two things in mind, that the process of evaluating information and verifying it is cognitively expensive, and that you will always be working against the truth, because quite frankly, clickbait headlines are more exciting than truthful information.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much for bringing that into the conversation, Gideon. I suppose there's also, the interplay between just private interests, I suppose, and the truth, so to speak. And oftentimes, as you've mentioned, money can be made from, kind of spinning situations, and especially communication about situations. And that's always something that we are kind of acting, kind of against, right? So we are, again, encouraging any questions that I suppose the audience might have to be sent in. Please do so by submitting them through the question and answer tab here. But we would then like to move and invite Lillian, if she's still on the call. Right, so this is a section where Lillian and Gideon, I suppose, could kind of collaborate on. The question a little bit more generally is, what was the general experience doing research, this live demonstration and the other phases that we have touched on? What was the general experience doing that research, and what are we planning for next steps, I suppose, if there is something such as next steps in the course of this work? Lillian, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you, Mugi. I think overall, this whole research project just emphasized the importance of collaboration when you're looking at something as complex as mis and disinformation. Not just from the, we have the HIP and the TED team, we had UNDP team, we had Busara team, we had PesaCheck, and that's just on a small research piece. So as we're looking at the broader, information pollution space, it's very clear that there are so many other partners that need to be brought on board. You mentioned media and other key players in the fact-checking ecosystem. As you said, all of this, the responsibility is kind of shifting now to the users and the consumers. So how do we add in that element of users being active, players within addressing the issue of mis and disinformation? So I think overall it's been a learning experience. And then also for us at the Accelerator Labs, because this was part of our experiment with other countries, being able to connect and see what are some of the insights that are coming from the other countries. Some of them are looking at misinformation through the climate change lens. Others were looking at, COVID-19 or specific topical things that were happening in their countries, and trying to connect some of the dots in terms of particularly the user motivations. If you're thinking about the sustainability and longevity of these approaches, it's really important that we tap into the users and keep them invested and motivated to keep using these kind of tools beyond the initial push of the campaign. In terms of next steps for us, currently we're having, of course, with Kenya being in an election period, lots of conversations and discussions around approaches that we're going to look at when it comes to tackling harmful content online, in online spaces that would cause harm. So, I think Enoch spoke really well about whether it's hate speech or the lies and manipulation. What are some of the approaches that can be used to address that? So whether working with different partners like the National Commission of Integration and Cohesion, IBC and the like. So seeing how strategies can be applied based on the learnings that we have from this project, and also some of the technology approaches. So in Zambia last year during the election, there was an initiative called I Verify that UNDP supported. So where they had a similar kind of platform for reporting misleading claims related to the election period. So there are some conversations to see if a similar kind of pilot would be done in Kenya and how that would look like within that context. So we're really excited to see how the project and the learnings from this will kind of grow and inform even future, as we're looking at not just this election period, but beyond. I think we talk a lot about elections, but beyond elections, how we're engaging with in the civic space with the people and the public, considering that, like we said, the internet spaces, this is the reality that we're living in. So we need to learn how to work in that reality. So over to you, Gideon.
Thanks, Lillian. That's a very important point on wanting to find or seeking solutions that are in the context that we live in today. And as when we started this project a year and a half ago, I think we've learned so much about the world and how information spaces have evolved. And one of the things that I've been personally thinking about is beyond finding solutions to enable people to verify information, because that's, like I mentioned, very cognitively expensive. I'm starting to see that there might be potential solutions in trying to stop people from sharing information in addition to verifying that. And the reason I'm saying that is, when you're thinking about, when I think from different research sources, when you prompt or nudge a user to think about the accuracy of a piece of information before they share it, they're more likely than not to not share it, because they've been prompted or nudged to pause and think about it. But this doesn't always work. So even if you're having users being trained on how to identify misinformation, a lot of them or they're more likely to just send it to their networks for one reason or another. So thinking of high impact solution to stop or to slow the spread of false news by helping users to stop and reflect on the accuracy of what they're seeing before they click share. So instead of catching up with corrections and warnings of misinformation, we think about accuracy prompts that can help people or slow down the spread of misinformation. So for example, maybe to give a couple of concrete examples, if for example, there's a pop-up that shows up when someone wants to share or forward a piece of information on WhatsApp or on social media or somewhere, that can just nudge them or ask them to think about for a few seconds the accuracy of the headline that they've come across. And we can see whether they'll be more likely to forward that or not, and whether we can test that with neutral information, misinformation, or positive information. We can also think about ways of packaging digital literacy tips that people can engage with real time. And I think all of these speak to engaging with these gatekeepers, like social media companies or news agencies who have a lot of content online, to sort of come up with interactive ways of doing this. And I think Lillian has alluded to the point on the Kenyan elections at the moment, which is really important. I think the connections between online spaces and a vibrant democracy is fundamentally about information. It's what political information you come across. And the creators of this information are important, but also the channels through which this information is disseminated is equally important. And so what we're seeing, and I think it's not unique to Kenya, over the last, say, 10 years or so, we're seeing these fault lines that are being reinforced because of social media. Users relying on their direct networks or people they know, people they trust, or people who are like them for information. So that means it's eroding the quality of political discourse on these platforms, on social media platforms. And that also means the political discourse of these platforms in real life are also on the decline, because we don't want to hear what the other side wants to say. We just want to reinforce what we know and look for information from people who are like us. And so this election season is, I think, another important reminder that the same information pollution mechanisms that we experienced with the COVID-19 pandemic are being experienced at the moment and will continue being experienced even after the elections. But it's an important reminder for us to continue seeking solutions, long-lasting solutions to this problem of misinformation and disinformation, because as we've seen, permeates across different segments of life.
Thanks, Gideon. And if I could just also add, you talk about, slowing down the spread of misinformation. I think there's also room to look at how do we speed up the spread of the fact-checked claims. Like you talked about, misinformation usually it's clickbait, it's easy to share, it's very immediate, but the fact-checking process, you might have the claims being, the article coming out maybe a week, 2 weeks later. So how do you make sure that we get as many clicks and eyeballs as well on that kind of content, so that we're kind of balancing the scales or shifting the scales in terms of how quickly the false news spreads versus how the facts are spreading. So that's also one of the kind of experiments that we've been doing, looking at, can we build on some of the digital marketing strategies and ad campaigns to see how to kind of shift some of those power imbalances, so that as much as you're getting so many eyeballs on the catchy headlines, but the work that the fact checkers are doing is intensive and time intensive and resource intensive. How do we make sure that that also is reaching the audience to kind of balance that out?
Right. Thank you both so much. And Lillian, while you're on it, I wondered whether you wanted to touch on just the recommendations that I suppose came off the study between UNDP and Busara, the recommendations for change or improvement, hopefully improvement to the HIP plugin. Is that something that you'd like to touch on briefly, or just speak about more generally?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the things have already been mentioned over the course of the conversation. The issues around reinforcing the anonymity to make sure that the users are comfortable. Ruth, shared about giving an insight to the backend so that users are aware that once I submit, this is what happens on the other end, and there's that kind of clarity to the process. We talked about the media literacy and being able to understand out of the different categories, this is what it means when I say this is lies and manipulation or harmful and all that. And perhaps, removing the worthwhile content part so that we kind of minimize maybe the noise or the scope of the flags that we're getting to kind of focus specifically on harmful content or misleading claims. But beyond that, especially for us in Kenya, majority of people access the internet on their mobile phones. So the fact that the plugin is limited to your PC or desktop, I think is kind of a huge limitation. And it's important to have tools that are adaptable to mobile phones and easier to integrate, with existing, whether it's with existing apps or whatnot, because that's where majority of people are accessing the internet from. I think we've talked about the feedback mechanisms, making sure that once the content has been flagged, how do we know if I flagged something? Well, how do I know what happened with that flag? So being able to give feedback back and share that, these are some of the claims that we looked at, and this is what came out of this, to kind of keep that engagement going. And I think also Ruth brought up the point around the gamification. So these are all aspects that can be leveraged not just for the HIP platform, but any similar kind of tools or reporting channels that other partners may want to launch into the space.
Right. Thank you, Lillian, for that note. I suppose it occurred to me that it's really useful to bring it all back together and relate it very closely to what it is that the HIP platform itself and the collaboration, the study collaboration between Busara was trying to achieve. We are, again, just encouraging for more questions to come in through the question and answer function itself. We have seen there's one here, I'll direct it accordingly, but I want to start first just very quickly by asking a little bit more generally, right? What does the state and the rise of misinformation have to do, I suppose, with the decline in independence, right? By major media houses across, Kenya, but also just across, the global stage a little bit more recently, right? There's been no shortage of complaints, I suppose, about the extent to which what were previously trusted news sources, the extent to which these have been shoved into the back pockets of many corporate interests at times, or entrenched political camps and ideologies, and so on and so forth. So just as a general, kind of like question before we take the one from the audience, and anyone from the panel is welcome to take it. What does the rise of misinformation, I suppose, have to do with the supposed decline in the independence by what used to be our trusted media houses and trusted sources of information? Anyone from the panel, please feel free to just unmute yourself and speak to it. I will follow up with a question from an audience member after that. So very briefly, please.
Let me take that one first. Yeah, one of the negative effects of misinformation, not that there is a positive one, but is trust. Trust has gone down, trust in the media, because those who spread misinformation and influence operations want to create doubt, to make users to doubt the reporting that the mainstream media does. Of course, the mainstream media also gets some stories wrong, and the correct thing to do, which I think they can borrow from fact checkers. Fact checkers are worldwide, operate on uniform standards set by the International Fact Checking Network. So they have like high standards globally, whether you are in Kenya, whether you're in the US or the UK, the standards are the same. And one of them is, if you make a mistake, you're supposed to correct it fast enough, give it the same prominence that you gave the story that was misleading at first. So being honest, being transparent, the mainstream media sometimes they rely on anonymous sources, so sources that are not disclosed, and that can be very difficult for a reader to sort of arrive at the same conclusion. If, for example, you are as a reader, you're going through a story and you are getting several anonymous sources to sort of like support a claim that is being made. So that makes it very difficult for the audience to actually go through the same process. As a scientist, like if you follow through the scientific process, you should arrive at the same conclusion as the writer. And that's what fact checkers do, giving the audience all the resources they have used, all the sources. One of the principles is actually transparency of sources and even funding. Like they clearly state who is funding them, if they have a conflict of interest. Another key principle is non-partisanship. Are you biased? Because if there is a perception that you are biased or you are owned by this political group, or you're receiving funding from this part of the political divide, then users are less likely to trust you when you are reporting on that subject. And I think it can be the mainstream publishers can regain a lot of trust by being more transparent, being more authentic, admitting when they make mistakes, correcting them with the same prominence that they did the news stories. That way you earn trust, and users know, like, you don't have an agenda, you're not trying to push something. They know is funding you, how you get all your money. You give them the sources that you have used to arrive at the conclusion, so that they don't have to trust you. They can use the same method of I'm using now the example of fact checking. They can use all the process you've used and arrive at the conclusion, so they don't have to trust you. I think if the mainstream media borrows some of those key principles from the fact checkers, they can regain a lot of trust.
Right, thank you for that. And if I could just come back on that comment that you've made there about, I suppose, disclosing sources of income and revenue in an effort to appear more transparent. Like, I would ask, I suppose, whether or not it is even ethical, right, for bodies that are to be tasked with the responsibility of sharing accurate information. I would ask whether it's even ethical for them to be receiving certain monies, right? And if it's not entirely ethical always to be receiving, say, money from entrenched interests, then how can these bodies stay in business, right? Because that's always the challenge. maybe this is something other people might relate to as well. So I use Wikipedia sometimes to check for information. I'm certain that the information is not always 100% correct because, people, it's somewhat of a crowdsourced effort putting information on Wikipedia, but always they leave a little banner sometimes and tell people to donate $1, to support the work that they do. But I have never, ever given any money myself. So there's a little bit of tension that I see there, right? The media industries might be interested, and not just media industries, but purveyors of accurate information might be interested in, just staying, I suppose, above board and not ever having a conflict of interest, but yet they still have to fund their operations, do they not? So how exactly do you suggest that, or what is the conversation around that dilemma?
Yeah, it's something that has been the disruption of the revenue models for the media in the past decade has been very challenging. I've been on the Kenya media scene for about 10 years now, and I used to work for local news. I worked on a site which we also collaborated with Busara, by the way, to do some research. So I used to be at TV Sasa, which was a local news site providing county level content, and we built a very popular platform. Like we used to get a lot of users competing with the mainstream press. But because of the disruption of the revenue models, there was no political affiliation or receiving funding from such sources. Such media outlets sort of collapsed. And we've seen that trend happen all over the world. And what we now have in some cases is media outlets that are owned by politicians, or at least some funding from them, and then they don't disclose that openly on their websites. And yeah, they are sort of like they try now to report. There's that concept of objectivity, trying to report on that subject. Like if I own a certain news outlet and it's reporting about me, how do we know, for example, that they're doing it objectively? I think there needs to be a clear statement on whether they're independent, especially the editorial team. That's the key thing, like those who make key editorial decisions. A news outlet can be owned by someone who is in politics or in power or somewhere, but if there is the independence of the editorial team, who can be trusted to carry on the work of producing non-partisan stories, then that can work. But if there is no objectivity, the coverage is partisan, then users are less likely to trust you to report accurately on certain political sites. So I think it's more to repair that situation, being more honest. Even when you are owned by certain individuals, trying to separate the editorial team to make independent decisions. Even for media outlets that are not owned by politicians, there's still a conflict between the editorial team and the commercial or the sales department. For example, if you let's say, let me give an example of an hypothetical case, of course, of a story touching on a major commercial company which advertises on this media publication, but then there's like a negative story. So obviously the sales team, which is in charge of bringing revenue to the organization, may not want to see such a damaging story being done by this publication. But for a newsroom which has an independent editorial team, which means the commercial team does not encroach, does not come to the editorial team to tell them on stories to do and those not to touch. If there's the separation of powers, everyone operates independently, that still works. But in some cases, it doesn't. It gets to a point where big advertisers don't get covered when they have negative stories about them, and that affects the trust, reduces the trust that users have on the publication, because with the decentralization of the way users get news right now, we have Twitter, Facebook, all these platforms. If the mainstream media does not cover a certain big story, others will do it and users will see. So all of these things I'm speaking about, I think have led to the decline in trust. So that's why some, especially in the West, and I'm seeing that trend in Kenya, now news outlets are trying to become less dependent on advertisers, trying to generate their own revenue through subscriptions, through getting the audience to sort of donate or pay for the news that they consume per week, per month. Such models have worked in the West. It remains to be seen whether they'll succeed in Kenya, but all of that it's complicated because there's also the issue of, if you have paywalls, if you don't allow citizens or ordinary people to access news on your platform. I think at the moment, Nation have some sort of a paywall. The Standard have something close to that. So it's a trend we are seeing, and you can understand why. But if there is limited access to accurate information, are you not leaving room for those who spread disinformation to mislead the people because they can't access accurate information? So it's an ongoing debate. There's no clear answer, but I think gaining trust can go a long way in sanitizing the information ecosystem.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Anak. I feel like that's very fortunate that I suppose we have started off with conversations and, outlining of a, experimental situation, but we've kind of opened it up toward the end, and really, I suppose, Anak has basically, given us quite a lot to think about as we come to the close of the session today of the webinar. I'd like to turn it over to Lillian and Gideon just for some quick final remarks. This can have anything to do, I suppose, with the content itself of the presentation, but also any call to action that you might have saved for the end. And this would be the moment. Gideon, do you want to start and then hand it over to Lillian?
Sure. I think in closing, so a problem like misinformation and disinformation in online spaces, I think that multiple entry points for organizations like fact checkers and the Busaras and UNDPs to contribute to long-lasting solutions. But I think from experience and seeing sort of what works and what doesn't work, it's just that gradual series of attempts to try and chip away at the problem one step at a time. So I saw someone actually in the chat box on the Q&A ask, how do you deal with the bystander effect problem? So bystander is basically a theory where individuals are less likely to take action when they're in the presence of other people. So in an online space, digital public sphere, you would assume that someone else will have the responsibility of flagging misinformation, so I don't need to do something. So I think the various efforts that we're all taking should be geared towards trying to tackle this behemoth monster that is misinformation in small, doable ways. And one of the ways is just to demonstrate the impact of polluted information space in individual and collective ways, how that is harmful, or even making flagging of misinformation a norm, such that you're not even thinking about maybe there's someone else doing this. Facebook has an army of fact checkers, but the individual responsibility lies with me. Or I think earlier Lilia mentioned that starting to think about the feedback loops. So can we find a way of demonstrating the outcome of your taking action to flag misinformation and what that led to? So all of these are various potential solutions that we should all continue to experiment on and find long-lasting solutions to misinformation, because the internet is not going anywhere anytime soon. Over to you, Lillian.
Thanks, Gideon. So I'll start off with the question about HIP in the context of the elections. So in terms of where we go with HIP from now, so this is a prototype, like I mentioned, that's being incubated at TED, and we're basically using this tool to test out this crowdsourcing approach for us at this point, the HIP tool is still available for use. I think in terms of landing this as a tool for targeting mis and disinformation, it's really important to connect it with the key players. So I think I've seen Christine in the chat talking about institutions like the Media Council of Kenya, Communications Authority. All of these players need to be connected on the back end so that beyond the flagging of the content, what happens once it's flagged. And I think that's where we're trying to see, as we're looking at strategies around how we're going to support elections, how do we make sure that we are connecting all of those dots? So whether that's, that may not be specifically with the HIP tool, because we know that there are different kinds of platforms and tools already available, but just seeing within the network of partners and relevant stakeholders, how can we build on what's already existing so that we are not introducing a new, I guess, tool into the space. So I hope that answers that. In terms of where we go from here, I think we've spoken, in terms of the respective organizations, but I think just bringing it back to us as individuals, we are also, people on the internet engaging with content. So just coming back to that lens of how do we engage with this information? How do we face the WhatsApp aunties? And how do we also kind of reverberate what we are sharing within our network so that we're having this ripple effect as individuals who are aware of this information and are curious. I think the fact that we are here having this conversation puts us a few steps ahead of maybe the average internet user. So seeing how we give back to our society so that we are also playing a hand and, like avoiding the bystander effect like we talked about. So thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Lillian. Thank you, Gideon. I think that does bring us officially to the end of our webinar today. Thank you so much for everyone who made the time to come and be with us. Apologies, my colleague Brenda experienced a little bit of internet disruption and had to drop off from the call, but our thoughts are generally represented throughout the preparation documents. Whatever it is that you've seen on the slides does bear, I suppose, her testimony of what it is she thinks about the work itself, but she also sends her thanks. That, I suppose, is it from everybody. Thank you for those who left questions on the Q&A function itself. The panelists have been able to answer people one-on-one as well. So we hope that conversations about, just the state of misinformation and disinformation on the internet will continue with our panelists even beyond this call today. But that's it, I suppose. If there aren't any other closing remarks, then I suppose it falls on me to wish everybody a good day. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.